Jane, come back, Jane. Please come back.
Jane Eyre.
Where are you, Jane? Come back, Jane.
Look at this, Jane.
You terrible sinner, come here when I call you.
Miss Eyre, Miss Eyre.
Mademoiselle Jane, please come back.
Don't forget me, Jane.
Look at the girl, look at the liar.
Dearest Jane.
This is the story of Jane Eyre. It is a story that happened over 150 years ago. The world was very different then, but people do not change very much. They still long for the same things. Sometimes those things are very simple. Sometimes they're very difficult to describe, as in the case of Jane Eyre. I know that story well. It is my story.
And mine.
And mine.
I was born the daughter of a clergyman, but both my parents died when I was very young. So I was sent to live at Gateshead, the home of my Uncle Reed.
He was my father's brother, and a very dear man.
I remember him. He always smelled like oranges and tobacco, and he would read to me.
But when I was 6, he died too.
He was my only friend. On his deathbed, he made my aunt promise that she would never send me away, and would raise me with her own 2 daughters.
Georgiana and Eliza. I hate them.
From the day my uncle died, I was always an unwanted relative at Gateshead.
I dined with the servants and was never included in family activities.
I don't care. I hate them all.
Except Bessie.
Except Bessie.
A servant, but the only one who was not always after me. The Red Room was my uncle's bedroom when he was alive. He died in that very bed. It was in this room where he lay in state. No one at Gateshead even went in there except for the housemaid to dust on Saturdays. Eliza said it was haunted. Even Mrs. Reed would not stay there.
I'm not afraid.
But I was, a little. I cried myself to sleep. And then, in the middle of the night...
Frightful child, frightful child.
What fury to fly at Miss Georgiana like that?
You've no business to take our books. You're dependent. Not one of these books belongs to you.
Take her to the Red Room and lock her in there. Take her to the Red Room. The Red Room. The Red Room. The Red Room.
I didn't know whether I was awake or asleep. Was it a nightmare? Or was it real?
The ghost of Mr. Reed rises up from the bed. His face is all white and wrapped in a death cloth around his jaw. He stands on the bed and stares at Jane.
The room was haunted. It was the ghost of my uncle. I never did forget it. Although I was only 10 years old, I believe it changed my life in some way. I always knew I was unwanted, and I knew I was very unhappy. But now I realized that I must live somewhere else if I was not to die of sadness and grief. 2 months after this incident, a visitor came to Gateshead. 50 miles I traveled in the coach with strangers, never knowing how much longer I had to go. Then, late at night, the driver woke me and I was let off at the gates of Lowood Institution, a long stone building with high walls and a little light coming in the many windows.
Jane Eyre?
Yes, ma'am?
This way.
Into the dark stone building I went. All was quiet. I neither saw nor heard any other students. She took me through a long, dark passageway to the kitchen where there were some stale rolls for me to eat. They were cold. The kitchen fire was out and it was cold too. The whole building was cold. And where were the other girls? I did not see any of them until morning.
Dearest and forgiving God.
Most of the girls were older than I. Few of them gave me any notice at all. They all appeared weary and were shivering with cold. The porridge seemed hot, but smelled terrible. I looked at the other girls, and I could tell that they could smell it too. Then I looked to the girl they called Burns. Her eyes were kind. I spoke to no one, and no one spoke to me all day. We studied in groups, each lesson set by the clock and very strictly adhered to. The teachers were firm, but not cruel. Miss Miller always seemed to pick on the girl they called Burns. Miss Temple was the most gentle. I liked her immediately, and sometimes even felt sorry for her because she seemed so concerned for us about the cold and the food. It wasn't until the second day that we had some free time, and I sought out the girl named Burns. Helen Burns seemed to be totally without malice or discontent. She did not fight back, not because she was afraid or too weak, but because she rose above all the injustices of the world. She would become my close friend over the next few weeks, and I soon found myself wanting to be better, to improve myself so that I could please Helen. My real education had begun.
You must watch her, scrutinize her words and actions, punish her body to save her soul. Now, 'tis time for noontide prayers, I believe.
There I was, standing like a statue of humiliation itself. After 30 minutes, Miss Miller told me to step down, and I retreated to the corner and wept. I had meant to be good. I so wanted to win friends and respect, and maybe even affection. I thought I was making progress. Now I would be scorned and mistrusted by my fellow pupils. My teachers would suspect me of every dishonest act possible.
You should not be without friends.
Perhaps all was not lost. I had one true friend, the first friend I ever had, and I would not give up Lowood Institution or Mr. Brocklehurst or anything else for that dear, dear friendship. Helen was right, of course. After a day or two, the girls treated me just as before. Then, about 3 weeks later, just as spring arrived and the constant coldness started to depart, something happened that changed Lowood forever. Good Miss Temple. Helen was right about her as well. But where was Helen? But Helen was not better the next day, or the day after, and by the end of the week, 6 other girls were in the infirmary. It was the typhus, just as Miss Miller had probably suspected. Spring brought with it sickness, and the aura of death hung over Lowood School.
Helen will not be with us for much longer.
Oh, Miss Temple, Margaret Wells has started convulsing.
Oh dear, quickly!
Yes.
Not be with us for much longer? It almost sounded like she would be leaving on a trip. But I knew otherwise.
I must see Helen. I must speak with her.
So many girls were ill that the infirmary was too crowded for all of them. Helen lay in a little dark room where they stored firewood. When it was dark, I was able to sneak off from the back way without anyone seeing me.
Helen?
Asleep? Or dead already? I dare not call her name any louder, or I would be discovered.
So sleepy. Good night, Jane.
Good night, Helen.
She seemed so well, so peaceful. She was already getting better. I slept at her bedside that night. I slept soundly and had no dreams that disturbed my slumber. The next morning, when I awoke, Helen was gone. She had died in the night, and her body was taken quickly away. They buried her in the Brocklehurst churchyard, not a marker or a stone to mark the place, just a grassy mound. It stayed that way for 15 years. Today, a marble stone sits on the spot. It says, "Helen Burns, I rise again." I mentioned that the typhus epidemic changed Lowood School forever. 16 girls died and an investigation by the parish was made. The unhealthy living conditions, the poor quality of the food and clothing, the lack of adequate heat were all discovered and declared a disgrace. Mr. Brocklehurst was no longer in charge, and the parish committee wrote new regulations and outlined improvements that eventually made Lowood a truly useful and noble institution. I remained as a student for 5 years and proved to be quite good at French, mathematics, and drawing. It was this last area that I showed skill in and which brought me both commendation and pleasure. At the end of my studies, I was asked to stay on and teach art at Lowood. As I was not wanted at Gateshead and knew nowhere else to go, I agreed.
The young Jane Eyre, who first arrived at Lowood, was now gone forever.
Gone as far away as Helen Burns had gone. But who was this new Jane Eyre?
I think you all have the idea. Now, fetch your cloaks and your sketchbooks, and we will go out into the garden and try some drawing from nature. It's too beautiful a day to stay indoors and sketch the same old bowl of fruit.
For 3 years, I was a teacher at Lowood, and while I loved my work and felt that what I was doing was useful and rewarding, I was restless. I had seen nothing of the world. I had never ventured beyond the hills that surrounded Lowood. What did I know of life except from books? So I took a bold step. I placed an advertisement in the Herald and cast my fate on what might occur.
A young lady accustomed to teaching is desirous of meeting with a situation in a private family where children are needing a governess. She is qualified to teach the usual branches of a good English education, together with French, drawing, and music. Inquiries can be made to J.E., Post Office, Loughton, Yorkshire.
2 weeks later, on my afternoon off from teaching, I walked the 3 miles to Loughton Post Office.
Are there any letters for J.E.?
There was one letter addressed to J.E.
If J.E., who advertised in the Yorkshire Herald of last Thursday, possesses the acquirements mentioned, and if she is in a position to give satisfactory references as to character and competency, a situation can be offered her where there is but one pupil, a little girl, and where the salary is £30 per annum. J.E. is requested to send references, full name, address, and all particulars to Mrs. Fairfax, Thornfield Hall, near Millcote, Yorkshire.
£30 a year! That was twice what I was getting at Lowood. And Thornfield Hall, did it not sound like an elegant and respectable place? And didn't Miss Fairfax write in such an educated and genteel manner? I secured the references she requested, and in 2 weeks' time, I bid farewell to the only true home I had ever known. What adventures awaited me, indeed, if only Miss Temple knew what lay ahead. I know I did not. After many hours in the coach, I arrived at Millcote. It was dark already, but I could see that it was little more than a village. I inquired how one got to Thornfield Hall, and a man named John let himself be known and told me he was sent to pick me up in the carriage. It was 6 miles to Thornfield, he said, and every inch of it seemed endless to me. As we approached, the moon came out from behind the clouds, and I could see Thornfield, a huge, rambling mansion with towers and buildings rising from the main house. It looked large and lonely in the weak moonlight.
Miss Eyre?
Yes.
Will you come this way? Mrs. Fairfax wishes to see you.
Inside, the house seemed just as dark and lonely, but one room had a warm fire and a friendly face. The way from Mrs. Fairfax's sitting room to the second floor took us past rooms and staircases and hallways. No furniture was covered or rooms closed off. It seemed that everything was kept in readiness for the master in case he should suddenly arrive.
Here you are, my dear.
What was that?
One of the servants. Leia, I hear Grace Poole. See to it.
Yes, ma'am.
Grace has a habit of drinking, especially when she's lonely, which seems often enough. There, she'll be quiet now. Let us see to your room, if your room is nice and warm.
I heard the noise no more that evening, but the sound of that strange laughter still rang in my ears. I never heard anything like it before, but I was unfamiliar with the evils of drink, and perhaps it was not that uncommon a sound after all. The next morning was a cheerful fall day, and I was indeed able to see portions of a large garden from my window. Thornfield seemed far less gloomy in the daylight, and my spirits lifted. Adele was a charming, if somewhat spoiled girl, but she was bright and learned quickly. I gathered that she lived quite a luxurious and idle life with her mother in France, but the poor thing was so starved for affection now that she would do anything for a friendly smile. On 2 other occasions did I hear the strange laughter, both times at night. It seemed to come from above me, somewhere on the 3rd floor, and one night, as I left my room, I finally saw Grace Poole. I saw Mrs. Fairfax go to the end of the passage where there was a door leading up to the 3rd floor room. It was always kept locked, and only Mrs. Fairfax and Grace Poole had the keys. Mrs. Fairfax unlocked that door, then disappeared into the darkness. That night, despite what words Mrs. Fairfax had had with Grace, I heard the laughter again. Louder and more desperate than before, and then a crying sound. A low moaning that continued on and off through the night. Why would Mrs. Fairfax keep such a servant? And what would the absent Mr. Rochester think of such a thing? It was several weeks later, when the full force of winter arrived, that I decided to walk into Millcote on my day off. It was getting dark as I returned walking along the moors. Suddenly, it seemed out of nowhere, a horseman passed me by and, trying to jump the stream that ran alongside the path, slipped on the forming ice and fell.
Lead him here, for God's sake. I can't get him. Go on.
I managed to bring the horse to the man and help him climb on its back, and then he galloped off without so much as a thank you or a good day. When I arrived at Thornfield, everything seemed to be in an uproar. Mr. Rochester, the mysterious Mr. Rochester returns at last. And asking for me?
The leg needs some ice.
What did I think of such a man? He frightened me somewhat, yet I felt sorry for him. I had never seen a person who struggled so inside. It was as though a battle raged within him. He was both dangerous and pathetic at the same time. I hoped we would not be left alone together often. Those eyes of his seemed to look right through me and into my soul, and I did not like it. No one had ever looked at me like that before, and I hoped no one ever should again. I saw little of Mr. Rochester over the next few weeks. He stayed mostly to himself in his study, brooding and silent. The few times he came to the library to see Adele at study, he only stayed a few moments, then quietly left. He paid little or no attention to me, and I much preferred it that way.
The figure is seen walking in the hallway, carrying a candle. Her hair is untamed and covers her profile. We cannot see who it is. She makes the low, laughing sound.
One night, I heard that laugh again. But it was not above me this time. It was coming from the hall right outside my door. Then he moved down the corridor. I opened my door slowly, but there was no one there. Yet, sitting on the floor was a candle left unattended.
Grace. Grace Poole?
I smelled something. Was it the candle? No, it was smoke. There were wisps of smoke coming from under one of the doors. It was Mr. Rochester's bedroom.
Jane enters the bedroom with a four-poster bed chair and a small table carrying a wash basin. There is bright orange light flickering, and Mr. Rochester is asleep in the bed.
Sir? Mr. Rochester!
The bed was on fire, and Mr. Rochester still asleep in it.
Mr. Rochester! Wake up! Please, wake up!
Is he dead? Am I too late?
Mr. Rochester!
What would he do? That woman was possessed. She tried to burn him in his bed. Why does he keep her here? What hold does she have over him? In a few moments, I heard the laughter coming now from above, followed by some screams, and then moaning, and then silence. I slept very little that night. I kept seeing those flames as they engulfed Mr. Rochester. And when I did doze off, I dreamt that all of Thornfield was ablaze, and Mr. Rochester was running from room to room looking for someone. Was it me? Did he ever think of me? A man like that would hardly give a second thought to a governess. Yet that night, the look of gratitude in his eyes was disarming. The next morning, who should I run into on the staircase but Grace Poole? The way Grace Poole looked at me, I think she realized that I knew all. I was glad I told her about bolting my door. Better she should know and not try anything foolish. Inside Mr. Rochester's room, Mrs. Fairfax and Leah were replacing the burnt and wet linens. I could hear them from the hallway.
Blanche Ingram?
A true beauty, she said, and obviously wealthy too. Are you jealous?
Ridiculous. I am nothing to him. He was pleased last night, that is all. After all, I had saved his life. Mere gratitude. But that is not the same thing as affection.
Then why all this interest in Blanche Ingram?
Look at yourself, Jane Eyre. You are plain. You are poor. You have no connections nor prospects. You are just a silly girl to even start to think of Mr. Rochester like that.
Why did he leave so suddenly, especially when he knew you wanted to see him?
He said he would explain about Grace Poole on another occasion.
You frightened him away, perhaps.
He does not even think of me. He has forgotten me already, just as I must forget him.
As you can see, I realized that morning that I was quite in love with Mr. Rochester. A foolish, unfounded love, perhaps, but powerful and disturbing all the same. The 3 days flew by as everyone in the household strained and hurried to prepare the large house for the guests. They arrived in several carriages. There was much laughter and singing as they disembarked and filled the house with joyous songs it had not heard in many a day. After dinner that evening, I was to present Adele to the ladies in the sitting room. Mr. Rochester had been very specific that I should remain with Adele. Perhaps he had not forgotten my existence completely. For nearly a week, the house was full of guests, and each night I was obliged to bring Adele to the ladies after dinner. I rarely spoke, and no one paid much attention to me, not even Mr. Rochester, who seemed quite preoccupied with Miss Blanche Ingram. On the last evening of the house party, someone suggested a game of charades, something I was quite unfamiliar with. Mr. Rochester and his mysterious guest did not join the party any more that evening. As for myself, I was anxious to get to my room and escape the accusing eyes of Lady Anne Blanche Ingram. but I did not sleep well that night. In my half-sleep, I thought I heard Grace Poole laughing again. Then, later, I was awakened by a scream.
Help! Someone help!
There seemed to be a struggle of some sort going on the third floor. The laughter had changed to moaning. A crying sound. Sounded like a heart breaking. I could feel the pain of that cry coming right through the wall. She was just on the other side, and I could almost feel her breathing on me. We managed to get Mr. Mason into the carriage just as the sun was rising. We stood watching as the carriage drove off, and then Mr. Rochester seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Just as Bessie had said, Mrs. Reed had taken to bed in the Red Room. Nothing had changed in there since the night I was locked in by my aunt. Now, there she lies, almost as white and ghostly as my late uncle when he was laid out there.
Is that Jane Eyre?
Yes, Aunt Reed. How are you, Aunt?
I remembered how I had vowed to never call her aunt, but this old and sick woman was no threat to me any longer. I felt sorry for her, neglected by her daughters, and all alone. And with those words, she drifted into a deep slumber.
You are forgiven, Aunt. Now sleep in peace.
My aunt never regained consciousness. For 6 days more she lay there, sometimes murmuring my name, sometimes moaning in her own dark world. When she did die, Bessie and I made all the funeral arrangements. Her 2 daughters came and then left, disinterested strangers preoccupied with their own affairs. 2 days after the burial, I left Gateshead forever. Mr. Rochester had granted me 10 days leave, but it was nearly 3 weeks before I was able to return. It was such a warm and lovely day that I decided to walk from the Millcote coaching inn back to Thornfield. About half a mile before I reached the house, I came upon him on the path, not very far from where we first met the night his horse fell. It was to be a small wedding, held in the local chapel in 2 weeks' time. Mr. Rochester wanted to buy me jewels and dresses and treat me like one of his spoiled mistresses from the past, but I would have none of it. A simple dress and a veil that I made myself was all that I required. He did present me with a long lace veil made in France, but it was not becoming on me, so I accepted it as a gift and would save it as a token of his love. Adele was overjoyed with the news of our upcoming wedding. She was more than willing to be spoiled by Mr. Rochester, letting him buy her a new frock and a hat. As for Mrs. Fairfax, she was surprised and a bit put off at first by the news of our engagement. I suppose she still held hopes of a union with the illustrious Ingram family. But after a day or so, she was equally happy for me and fussed over the few preparations that had to be made. I did not sleep soundly that night, nor did I expect to, being so full of thoughts about the next day. But when I drifted off to sleep again, I dreamed I saw Thornfield in flames, and again I saw Mr. Rochester running through the burning rooms looking for someone. Was it me? I tossed and I turned, and suddenly I awoke. At least I think I awoke. Perhaps it was another dream. I saw a figure of a woman moving in the room. Was it Grace Poole? Had I forgotten to bolt my door? I could not move. I watched the woman as she paced the room. Then she stopped when she saw the lace veil Mr. Rochester had given to me. She lifted it up, and then I heard that familiar and awful laugh. It was Grace Poole, and yet it did not seem like her slow and heavy walk. And then she did the most curious thing. Of course, it was all a dream, or so I thought. But when I awoke the next morning, on my bed lay the veil, ripped into 2 pieces. Mr. Rochester had once said he would explain about Grace Poole. I decided that such an explanation could wait no longer. I tried to see him at breakfast, but was told he and John were loading our luggage for the trip onto the carriage. Maybe once we were miles away from Thornfield, Mr. Rochester would find it easier to talk about Grace Poole. In the meantime, I decided to let the matter pass. After all, it was my wedding day. Up the path to Thornfield, Mr. Rochester dragged me, his eyes on fire, looking straight ahead and never once at me. Into the house, up the staircase, unlocking the door to the 3rd floor, up the narrow steps, and then into the room in which we had tended Mr. Mason's wounds. It was not until I left that awful little room that I was able to think. Mr. Rochester was married. I was not going to be his bride. Thornfield was a dungeon, not a home. Everything was not what it seemed. Now what would I do? Where would I go? I must run away. I must leave. But all I could do was sit on my bed and stare at the torn wedding veil. Did I spend the night wavering in my mind? Was I tormented by indecision? Was I praying for guidance to make the right decision? No. I was young and headstrong and knew what I would do because I loved him and could never settle for the role of either governess or mistress. I knew I must leave. With the few things I could carry with me and the little money I had, I left Thornfield in the dead of night. I said goodbye to no one, and no one knew I had left until morning, when I was many miles away. I took a coach as far as my money would take me. Then I set out on foot. I was so set on escape that I had no plan, no reason, no destination. In a village or two, I tried to get work as a seamstress or a teacher, but people were suspicious of a disheveled stranger with such a mad and driven look in her eyes. Soon I was begging for food, but I was no more successful at that than with employment. Finally, after 2 days without food or a warm place to sleep, I spotted a lone cottage with an inviting candle in the window. I headed to it, prepared to beg for anything to eat. But I never made it to the door. I did not wake for 2 days, they told me, and when I did regain consciousness, I looked into the friendly eyes of Diana Rivers, who was trying to spoon-feed me some broth. She asked no questions of me, but nursed me until I was able to sit up and speak. Soon I was well enough to get up and about. My kind benefactors treated me as a house guest, never prying into my past or questioning my hard circumstances. Both women were very well educated and had bright, lively minds. In the evenings, we discussed books and art. I even started drawing again, and the Rivers family were very admiring of my work. St. John was younger than Diana and Marie, but more serious and reflective. I always felt a little uncomfortable when I was alone with him, yet I liked him and respected his firm ways and strong character. In 2 months, I was once again teaching young girls, just as I had started at Lowood 4 years earlier, though it seemed an eternity ago. I kept the name Jane Elliott and made no attempt to contact anyone at Thornfield. Did this mean I did not think of Mr. Rochester? No. He appeared in my thoughts daily, but his appearance seemed dim and far away. I loved living with Diana and Marie at Marsh End, and St. John was a demanding but appreciative supervisor at the little school. I was content with the way things were, and I decided to settle for this kind of happiness. After I had been teaching nearly a year, even this happiness would be threatened. A free and self-reliant person, and with a fortune as well. This may seem like the end of the story of Jane Eyre, a happy ending in which a surprise bequest makes the heroine wealthy and all her troubles come to an end. But there was a bit more to tell. My encounter with St. John disturbed me greatly. I had left Mr. Rochester because he loved me, but could not marry me. Now I must leave St. John because he wished to marry me, but did not love me. Was I the most self-centered creature ever put on this earth? Or was I the most timid little thing ever to be blessed with good fortune? I was myself, as I told St. John, but who was that self? I did not yet know. That night, I again had the dream in which Thornfield was ablaze. Again, Mr. Rochester ran through the house searching for someone, but this time he stopped and called my name.
Jane, come back, Jane. Please come back.
By morning, I knew what I had to do. I would return to Thornfield, not as a penniless governess, not as a damaged and jilted bride, but as a woman of independent means who wishes to be near the only man she's ever loved. I took the coach only as far as Millcote, then walked the rest of the way to Thornfield. Oh, how I longed to see the old house sitting in the vale, waiting for me to return as if it was my own home. But when I cleared the last hill and looked down, my eyes met only with blackened ruin. Where Thornfield once stood, only charred timbers, scattered stones, and an overgrown garden remained. No sign of life except some birds making their home in one of the burnt-out towers. I was numb. I wandered through the ruins like a ghost, haunting familiar havens. Where had they gone? Were they all dead? I must find someone in the village who could tell me. I found the house servant Leah working in the local pub. And so I married Mr. Rochester. Edward and I adopted Adele, and a year later we had a little girl of our own. We have been married 12 years now and have 4 children. Edward's sight in one eye improved over time, and he was able to see our children grow and prosper. We never rebuilt Thornfield Hall, but lived at Ferndean, which became a crowded and happy home. I bought a marble stone for Helen Burns, a new schoolhouse for Morton Parish, and a mission for St. John in India. Adele married and now lives in London, where she speaks English all the time. I still read to Edward. He cannot see well enough to decipher the words, but he can see into my heart, and I into his. And what we find there is a lifetime of love.